I was ordered to kill you.
Then why am I still breathing?
Because I refuse to become their monster.
They stole your voice.
They took more than that.
I could give it back, but you may beg me to stop. This will expose everything inside you.
Seraphine.
You weren't supposed to know that.
Major Devon Harlan had a tell. When he was about to issue an order that would never appear in any official record, never logged, never attributed, never surviving a proper audit, he placed his coffee cup on the left side of his desk and left it there, cooling and untouched, for the entire duration of the meeting. It was an involuntary gesture. Corvin doubted Harlan knew he did it. Most people's tells lived below the threshold of their own awareness, which was precisely what made them useful. Sergeant Male Corvin noticed the cup the moment he stepped through the briefing room door. It sat 8 inches from the desk's left edge, handle angled toward the wall, the surface of the coffee flat and undisturbed. He stood at attention. Harlan was studying a data slate and did not look up. "Sit down, Sergeant," Corvin sat. The chair was the standard military issue variety, aluminum frame, no padding, designed by someone who believed that comfort was operationally counterproductive. Harlan's aide, Lieutenant Price, stood at the room's far corner. He was the kind of young officer whose face hadn't yet learned to be opaque. You could still read what he was thinking, which right now was that he didn't entirely understand why he'd been included in this meeting or whether he wanted to be. He glanced between Corvin and Harlan with the careful measuring look of someone trying to understand the temperature of a room before deciding how much weight to put on the ice. "He doesn't talk, sir," Price said. His tone wasn't dismissive. It was genuinely, helpfully informational, as though Harlan might have missed this detail in the file. Harlan set the data slate face down on the table without showing it to either of them. "Good," he said. "Neither do dead men. Send him in." Price left. The door sealed with the specific pressure-locked sound that told Corvin this room was rated for classified conversation, a hiss of equalization, a magnetic thunk, and then the kind of absolute silence that only came from insulated walls and a conversations no one outside was meant to overhear. Harlan looked at Corvin directly for the first time. He was 63 years old and had the particular compacted quality of someone who had begun their career larger in various senses, and had gradually reduced over decades of difficult choices into something denser and harder. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had stopped asking certain categories of question because the answers had stopped changing anything. "You know the situation on Varath's surface," he said. Corvin gave one nod. The Varath conflict was in its 16th day of active ground engagement, following 4 years of sporadic contact, escalating skirmishes, and 3 failed diplomatic initiatives. The moon itself was approximately half the diameter of Earth, with a fractional nitrogen atmosphere requiring respiratory augmentation, a surface temperature that averaged -22 Celsius at midday, and rock the color of old bruises under a sky, perpetually darkened by the gas giant it orbited. It had no agricultural value, no mineral wealth of practical significance, no indigenous life more complex than microbial colonies in the thermal vents. What it had was a scanner array. Deep in Varath's mantle, geological processes spanning 200 million years had produced a crystalline lattice of rare earth compounds that resonated at frequencies capable of propagating through the Pallor Veil, the ionized nebula that separated human-explored space from Velhari territory. The veil was impenetrable to every communication, surveillance, and navigation technology either species had developed.
It made the border between them a genuine mystery. You could see the veil from either side, but you couldn't see through it.
You couldn't count fleets on the other side. You couldn't read troop movements. You were operating entirely blind on the most critical strategic question either civilization faced, which was, what is the other side preparing? Varath's array changed that. Through the crystalline lattice, with the right calibration, you could see not everything, but enough. Humanity had discovered it 11 years ago. The Velhari had known about it for 3 generations. The war had started 8 months after humanity announced the discovery publicly, which in retrospect was the kind of announcement that should have been made differently. "Then you know that 72 hours ago," Harlan said, "the Velhari's Third Claw, the Queen's personal escort formation, engaged our Eastern Ridge units at Sector 9. They took 80% casualties in the engagement. What you don't know, because it hasn't been entered into any system, is that the Velhari Queen was riding with that unit. Corvin held very still. A Velhari Queen on a battlefield was not a normal operational element. The Velhari had a concept of ceremonial leadership that sometimes required their sovereign to be present at significant military actions, not fighting, but present, in the way that human commanders had once ridden to the edges of battles to watch them. It was politics expressed through physical proximity, and it meant that the engagement at Sector 9 had been something the Queen considered important enough to witness personally. She survived the engagement, Harlan continued, wounded. Her remaining guard, approximately 8 personnel, down from 30, are currently pinned at grid reference 77 Alpha, 3 kilometers northwest of the observation post at Sector 9. She is not with them. He produced a physical data chip, not a digital transfer, and slid it across the table. Intelligence puts her in the drainage culvert beneath the old forward observation post, 30 meters below grade. Alone, alive on thermal imaging but not mobile. Corvin picked up the chip. He did not look at it yet. Your mission, Harlan said, is to locate her, confirm her condition, and determine whether she is a viable asset. The word asset did a lot of work in that sentence. If she can be transported and is not in immediate critical condition, Harlan continued, you bring her in. A Velhari Queen as a prisoner of war is the single most powerful negotiating position this conflict has ever generated. Command estimates a ceasefire inside 60 days. Peace terms inside 6 months. The Queen's body is a key that unlocks an end to this war. He paused. The air recyclers hummed their low, constant note. If she cannot be transported, Harlan said, with the careful, deliberate pacing of someone walking across ice, then there is no operational benefit to the Velhari having precise intelligence about her last known location or her condition. The room was very quiet. Corvin looked at the coffee cup. Left side of the desk, 8 inches from the edge, handle facing the wall. He had been a soldier for 12 years, and in 12 years he had learned that orders existed in layers. There was the order as stated, which was the version that would appear in records. And there was the order as understood, which was the version you lived or died by. Harlan was telling him to locate a wounded, isolated queen and bring her in if useful, kill her if not, and in either case maintain the kind of professional silence that came naturally to him now in ways it had not 3 years ago. He thought about the 19 people whose names he still ran through his memory some nights, in the way other people counted sheep. He thought about the order that had cost him all 19 of them, which had also been framed in clean professional language and had meant something underneath that language that he had understood and acted on and carried ever since. He picked up the data chip. He stood. He did not nod. Harlan, like most people, interpreted his silence as agreement. He inserted at 0230 local, dropping from a low-altitude insertion craft 2 kilometers northeast of the target coordinates. The craft was gone before he hit the ground. He would need to make his own way back. Moving across Varath's surface in the dark required managing 3 separate threat categories simultaneously. Human units that would shoot him if they didn't get the right IFF signal, Velhari units that would shoot him regardless, and the terrain itself, which was riddled with blast craters from 16 days of continuous engagement and had a habit of concealing structural instabilities under what looked like solid hardpan. He moved through it slowly and continuously, never hurrying, never stopping long enough to become a stationary target. He had learned this pace in training and refined it over 8 years of field operations and 3 years of solo work. Speed was for emergencies. What kept you alive in hostile terrain was patience and the willingness to take the long route every time. The battle noise was constant but distant artillery to the east, small arms fire in a sporadic rhythm to the south, the deep bass resonance of something much larger cycling up and down at the edges of his hearing range. The moon's thin atmosphere carried sound strangely, compressing some frequencies and losing others entirely, so that war was something you felt in your sternum as much as heard through your ears. He reached the ruins of the Sector 9 observation post at 0347. The structure was 2 days gone. A direct strike had turned it from a building into a collection of angular fragments arranged around a central crater. But the infrastructure beneath it was built into bedrock, and his scanner showed exactly what Harlan's intelligence had promised. One body, alive, 32 meters down, metabolic rate elevated, consistent with stress and injury, not moving. He spent 6 minutes on the approach watching the ruins' perimeter, checking for secondary thermal signatures, timing the scan sweep of a Velhari surveillance drone that crossed overhead at 4-minute intervals. When the drone was past and the perimeter was clean, he moved to the culvert entrance and went in from the side, keeping his silhouette against the wall rather than the opening. The drainage culvert was 3 meters in diameter, angled slightly downward, lit at 40% by emergency systems that painted everything amber. He moved through it in ground crawl posture, taking his time, reading the space as he progressed. Then he came around the curve and saw the Queen's honor guard, 7 of them, in the positions they'd fallen in. He processed them as non-threats in under a second and kept moving, but something flagged in his peripheral attention: the burn patterns on the stone around the bodies. Velhari ordnance left specific marks, a crystalline fracture network in the rock, caused by the pulse frequency, interacting with ionized mineral particles in the stone. He knew those marks from 16 days of reading Battlefield Aftermath. These marks had the primary thermal bloom, but not the secondary crystalline fracture. The shape of them was right. The secondary signature was wrong. He filed it for later and came around the final bend. She was at the end of the culvert, back against the curved wall, one hand pressed with clinical precision against her left side, legs extended in front of her, watching the western entrance. When he came through her peripheral vision, she was on her feet in half a second with her sidearm leveled before he had cleared the final turn. He stopped completely, raised both hands, turned them palms out. She was shorter than the intelligence photos had suggested. But there was something about the way she occupied space that made the physical dimension feel irrelevant. She held the weapon with the steadiness of someone who had been shooting since before they could legally hold office and who was not currently experiencing the tremor that came with adrenaline unless they had trained it out. The wound below her ribs was seeping dark through the gray of her uniform. Her face was controlled in the way that required active effort to maintain and was doing so without visible strain. He had read everything available about the Velhari. He had spent 3 years fighting them and researching them in the spaces between. He knew their physiological structure and their cultural framework and their military doctrine, and he had still, in some part of himself, expected something other than this. A person who was hurt and afraid and was doing neither of those things in any way that showed, which was the most human and the most unhuman quality simultaneously. She looked at him. He looked at her. He raised one hand slowly, telegraphed the motion entirely, and pointed at himself. Then he brought 2 fingers to his lips and shook his head once. Her expression shifted, small, contained, but real. Recalculation. He pointed to the translator implant at his ear, then touched his own throat and shook his head again. Then held both hands out, empty, waiting. "Who sent you?" The translator rendered half a second behind her words. He pointed at himself, then shook his head at his lips again, then held his hands out a second time. She held the weapon on him for a long moment. The amber emergency light moved slightly with the culvert's air circulation, throwing her face in and out of small shadows. Something in her expression completed its recalculation and arrived somewhere. The weapon came down, not holstered, angled at her side. It was a precisely calibrated statement about provisional trust and maintained caution, and he recognized it as exactly the same statement he would have made in her position. He reached slowly for his medical kit and held it out. "That is human medical equipment," she said. He opened his hands. "Yes, it is. You cannot know whether it will help me or cause a reaction." He tilted his head. "Fair point." She evaluated him for one more second. Then she sat back against the wall and her free hand went to the wound with the focused attention of someone who has decided to stop processing pain for the immediate future and do what needs to be done. "Give me the cauterizing unit and the coagulant spray." Velhari and human wound biochemistry converge significantly in the clotting mechanism. "The risk is manageable." He passed both items and turned his back on her, watching the western entrance, listening to the controlled sounds of someone who had decided that dignity required not being watched while managing their own damage. While he watched the entrance, he thought about the burn patterns on the stone, about the secondary signature that wasn't there, about the specific quality of the memory that came with it, deep, blurred, located somewhere in the 3-year archive that he couldn't always access cleanly. Somewhere past the pallor veil, coordinates that tasted familiar in a way that didn't match any mission he could consciously name. He couldn't pull it loose. He filed it again and let it settle. Behind him, done. A steadier voice. He turned back. She had holstered the sidearm. She was watching him with an expression that had moved, incrementally, from threat assessment to something more complex and harder to categorize. He pulled out his field tablet. Typed, Sergeant Male Corvin, 9th Recon, Allied Human Forces. She read it. Why can you not speak? He considered the question and what it deserved, which was the true answer.
Typed injury, 3 years ago. It severed the neural pathway between intention and production. I can form words internally.
I cannot project them. She was quiet for a moment. Above them, somewhere on the surface, something struck the ridge and the culvert shuddered once, through its entire length, before going still. Among my people, she said, and her voice had a quality that the translator couldn't fully render something that was being said carefully, like someone choosing a thing they actually meant. Those who carry their words inside instead of releasing them are considered to hold more. I do not know whether that is true. I have known many quiet people in my life. Some of them were empty and some of them were full. You, she said, look full. He did not have a response to that which could be typed quickly and accurately, so he typed instead, we need to move. My medical station now. You are taking me prisoner. He looked at her, at the fresh seal over the wound, at the 7 bodies of her guard arranged around them by whatever had found them here first, at the way she was holding herself not in defeat, not in fear, but in the posture of someone who had decided to face what was in front of them without looking away from it. He typed, I am taking you to a doctor, and after. He looked at the question on the tablet screen. He thought about Major Harlan's left side coffee cup. He thought about the 19 names he counted some nights when sleep didn't come. He typed, I don't know yet. She read it. She held his eyes for 5 full seconds. Then she said, that is the most honest thing anyone on either side of this war has said to me in 4 years. Lead the way, Sergeant Corvin. The route back to the human medical station took 43 minutes. He changed it 3 times to account for active fire zones, and once because a section of hardpan he'd crossed on insertion had become unstable in the intervening hours. Each time he stopped, she stopped, and she read the terrain the same way. He did, not waiting for direction, but assessing independently and arriving at the same conclusions. She moved well for someone who'd just sealed a wound under battlefield conditions with no anesthetic. He adjusted the pace without gesture or comment. She accepted the adjustment without acknowledging it. They moved through the dark surface of Vareth in the particular wordless coordination of 2 people doing the same job in a hard place, which was not friendship and was not trust, and was something that existed prior to both. He got her to the medical station entrance with 4 minutes to spare before a Velhari artillery round reshaped the ridgeline behind them. The explosion sent a column of displaced rock 40 meters into the dim sky, silent for 2 seconds, while the sound caught up with the light, and when the sound arrived she turned and looked at it with an expression he couldn't read. And then she looked at him, and whatever she was revising in her assessment of him, she did not yet have words for either. The MPs were on him before the medics reached her, 6 of them, weapons up, voices raised in the way voices raise when someone needs the situation to be unambiguous immediately. His designation, unit. What in the hell did he think he was doing? He raised his hands. Through the gap between 2 MPs' shoulders, he watched the medical team reach the Queen, assess her, and guide her through the bay doors with the competent, impersonal professionalism of people who had a patient in front of them and were going to treat the patient. She went through without looking back. He stood with his hands raised in the amber exterior light of the medical station and thought about the burn pattern on the culvert floor, and the memory he couldn't locate, and the data chip in his pocket that contained coordinates Harlan had given him for a different purpose entirely. He had made his choice. It was already out of his hands now. In the way that all choices were once made, the action existed, the consequences were in motion, and what remained was whatever came next. They gave him a room that was technically not a cell. It had the dimensions of a cell, approximately 4 meters by 3, with a cot, a sanitation unit, and a single light fixture that ran at 70% brightness and could not be adjusted. It had the door of a cell, a security lock that accepted only authorized credentials, with a viewport panel that could be opened from the outside. It had the atmosphere of a cell in the specific way that military confinement areas develop their atmosphere, the particular quality of air that had been breathed by people waiting for verdicts. But the paperwork said protective custody temporary quarters, and Corvin understood the distinction. Protective custody left options open. A cell was a decision. He was currently in the state of being a situation that hadn't yet been classified. Lieutenant Colonel Marsden from JAG arrived at 1000 hours the morning after Corvin's return. She was 45, efficient, and had the kind of expression that came from spending a career in military law, genuinely committed to the process, and under no illusions about what the process sometimes produced. She sat across from him with a recording device active and a legal pad physical. The physical pad was a tell of its own kind, meaning she expected to write things she would then refer to without the recording device capturing them. "Sergeant Corvin," she said, "I want to help you understand what you're facing, and I want you to understand that anything you communicate to me in this room is between us unless you waive that privilege." She paused. "You can write, correct? The neurological injury affects vocalization, but not written communication." He nodded and picked up the tablet they had given him. "Correct," he typed. "Good. Then I need you to explain, in your own words, what the mission briefing with Major Harlan contained and what actions you took on Varath's surface that resulted in your return with a Velhari national." He typed, "The briefing was classified. I cannot discuss its contents in a recorded environment." Marsden's expression shifted by approximately 2% towards something that said she had expected this. "I understand that. I'm asking about your actions subsequent to that briefing, which are not classified." "I located the individual on the surface. I assessed her condition. I made a tactical decision to transport her to our medical station rather than leaving her on a hostile battlefield." "A tactical decision," Marsden said. "Can you be more specific about the nature of that decision?" "She was wounded. Leaving a wounded individual on an active battlefield is not consistent with my training or my interpretation of the mission parameters I was given." Marsden looked at him over the legal pad for a moment. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "Major Harlan has provided a statement in which he indicates that your mission parameters were specific regarding the disposition of the individual you located. He indicates that your action directly contravened those parameters." Corvin typed, "I am not able to discuss classified briefing content in this environment." She held his gaze for a long moment. He held it back. He had developed in 3 years of communication through indirect means an ability to convey specific things through stillness and eye contact that most people required words for. What he was conveying currently was, "I understand exactly what I am doing." She wrote something on the physical pad. "All right," she said, "we will proceed with what's on the record. You need to understand that there are several charges potentially facing you, including insubordination, unauthorized action in a combat zone, and providing material assistance to a designated enemy national. These are serious." She paused. "The outcome will depend significantly on factors I cannot yet assess, including the nature of the individual you transported and how her presence affects the diplomatic and military situation." He typed, "How is she?" Marsden's expression shifted again, this time to something that was almost surprised. "She is being treated, as far as I understand. She will recover fully." A pause. "She has requested to see you." He typed, "I know." "How do you know that?" "Because she is the kind of person who would." Marsden looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something else on the physical pad, capped her pen, and stood. "I'll be back when the situation becomes clearer," she said. "I would strongly recommend that in the meantime, you don't speak to anyone without me present." He held up the tablet. "That will not be a problem." It was, he thought, the only joke he'd made in 3 years that required no translation. The request for a meeting between Sergeant Corvin and the Velhari Queen generated 6 separate rejection memos from 6 separate authorities over the first 18 hours, each citing a different subsection of military detention protocol. Then Seraphine of the Velhari invoked Velatran in a formal diplomatic communication addressed to the Joint Human Velhari Contact Protocol Office, a body that hadn't been used in 14 months because the war had rendered its function theoretical, and the rejection memos stopped being generated, and the authorities began instead to argue among themselves about what Velatran meant for a non-Velhari. Corvin followed this from his nada cell. through what he could piece together from the conversations in the corridor outside his door. Military personnel had a habit of discussing classified or sensitive matters in corridors outside secured rooms because they assumed the occupants of the rooms couldn't hear them, when the actual effect of the insulated walls was to quiet outside noise, from a volume that made words distinguishable to a volume that still carried conversation if you pressed your hearing carefully against the air. He heard the word Velathran 11 times in the first day. He heard unprecedented 7 times, and no legal framework 4 times. He heard, once, a voice he didn't recognize say, "The conclave envoy is suggesting we treat it as a non-binding cultural gesture and proceed with the tribunal," followed by a voice he did recognize, Lieutenant Price, saying, "The Queen is saying if we do that, the lifeline clause voids, and she considers the debt discharged by force," followed by a long silence. He didn't hear what came after that because 2 people walked past the outer corridor, and their conversation covered the voices he was trying to track. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dreshan arrived. Corvin knew who he was before he arrived. The formal notification of the conclave envoy's presence on the station had been announced through the internal system the night before, and Corvin had spent the intervening hours reviewing everything he knew about the conclave and their envoy from the general briefings that were part of his orientation file. The conclave was the galactic community's closest approximation to a neutral intergovernmental organization, an association of species who had agreed to a framework of non-interference and shared diplomatic protocol. They did not take sides in bilateral conflicts officially. They provided mediation services, monitored ceasefire agreements, and operated a communication network that spanned the sectors where member species lived. Dreshan was their senior envoy to the human Velhari region. He had held that post for 9 years, which meant he had been in position for the entirety of the conflict's development, from the earliest diplomatic failures through the escalation to open war. He had, by all accounts, tried very hard to prevent the war, attending 6 consecutive failed negotiations and producing 3 formal mediation proposals that both sides had ultimately declined. He came to Corvin's door at 1400 hours. The guard unlocked the viewport panel and Dreshan looked through it with the expression of someone evaluating a complex object they haven't yet decided how to categorize. He was physically distinctive. The conclave's founding species was the Alhari, who resembled humans in bilateral symmetry and basic morphology, but had a larger cranial capacity, eyes set slightly wider on the face, and skin that shifted between pale iridescent ranges depending on their internal temperature. Dreshan ran warm, which meant his face had a faint silver-blue quality, and his eyes were a color that didn't have a human name for it. "Sergeant Corvin," he said through the viewport. "I wanted to introduce myself. I am Dreshan, senior conclave envoy to this region. I am here in a mediating capacity." A pause. "I understand you find yourself in a complicated position." Corvin looked at him. He held up the tablet. Complicated is one word. Indeed. Dreshan looked at him with the particular quality of attention that came from someone who was very good at reading people and had just decided to apply full capability. "I want you to know that the conclave's interest is in a resolution that is best for all parties, including you." A pause. "The Queen's Velathran claim complicates the tribunal proceedings, but there are frameworks for handling these situations. Frameworks that don't require her presence on this station any longer than necessary and that allow the legal process to proceed on its normal timeline." He said this gently and informatively, with the smoothness of someone who had delivered many messages that meant something underneath what they said. Corvin looked at him for a moment, then typed, "What framework?" "A joint diplomatic tribunal," Dreshan said, "convened under conclave authority. Your actions would be reviewed by a mixed-panel human, Velhari, conclave observers. The Queen's testimony would be delivered via holographic link from Velhari space, rather than requiring her continued presence here. This protects her security, respects her diplomatic status, and allows the proceedings to," Corvin typed, "removes her from the station." Dreshan paused. Something in his expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of change. "It protects her," he said again carefully. Corvin typed, "From what?" "From the awkwardness of continued proximity to a military detention facility," Dreshan said, with the smooth unhesitation of someone who had prepared to answer in advance for exactly this question. Corvin looked at him. Dreshan looked at Corvin. There was a moment of very precise mutual understanding that neither of them acknowledged verbally. Corvin typed, "Thank you for coming by." Dreschen held his gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he smiled a small, careful, completely controlled expression and stepped back from the viewport. "Of course," he said. "I hope your situation resolves favorably, Sergeant. I'll be in touch." The guard closed the viewport panel. Corvin set the tablet down and sat for a while thinking about Dreschen and the specific quality of his interest in removing the Queen from the station, and the specific timing of his arrival, and the specific framing of his offer. She came to see him on the morning of the 4th day. He heard the negotiation in the corridor, first her voice, level and inflectionless through the door, stating something in Velhari that the corridor's ambient sound level, rendered as rhythm without content, and a guard's voice responding with the particular cadence of someone who was not sure they had the authority to say no to what they were being asked, but was attempting to say no anyway. Then a third voice, Price, Corvin thought, saying something that concluded the negotiation, and footsteps approaching the door. The door opened. Queen Seraphine of the Velhari was in civilian clothing, not a uniform, not formal robes, but the kind of well-made functional garments that said, "I am not performing anything right now." She had a slight careful quality to her movement that wasn't quite stiffness and wasn't quite pain management, but was somewhere between the two, which was consistent with a recently sealed wound that was healing well, but reminding her it was there. She entered. The guard stood in the doorway. "I need the room," she said, in English accented but clear. The guard looked at her and then at Corvin, and then made the calculation that was apparently not as complicated as it might have seemed, because he stepped back and pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it unlatched. She stood in the room and looked at him. He stood from the cot and looked at her. "You look worse than I do," she said, in English, which is interesting, because I was the one with the wound. He picked up the tablet. Typed, "I don't sleep well. Neither do I, but I have a proper bed. You have." She glanced at the cot. "What appears to be a protest mat." He almost typed something, stopped, started again, and typed, "It's not so bad." She looked around the room with the expressions of someone who had decided not to contradict a polite lie. Then she sat in the chair across from the cot because there was nowhere else to sit, and he sat back on the cot, and they looked at each other in the silence that two people develop when they have experienced something together and not yet found the right framework for discussing it. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to know that your answer will not affect my invocation of Velathrin. The debt exists regardless of the answer." He held up a hand. "Go ahead." "When you found me," she said, "you had a choice. You could see that. I could see that you had a choice, and I could see you making it." She paused. "I want to know what the choice was." He looked at her for a moment. Then he typed, "The choice was whether to do what I was told or what I thought was right, and you chose the latter." He typed, "I chose the latter. Why?" He looked at the question. He thought about how to answer it, all the true answers he had. The versions of the truth that were about 19 names and a different order on a different night. The versions that were about a neural pathway that no longer functioned, and the way that losing a voice had not taken away the things the voice had always only been approximate translations of. He settled on the version that was most direct. He typed, "Because I couldn't do otherwise. Some people can. I've tried. I'm not able." She read it. She was quiet for a long time. "My counselor Veleth," she said finally, "believes that your silence is a form of cultural contempt, that humans who do not speak in diplomatic contexts are making a statement about the value they assign to the interaction." He typed, "What do you believe?" "I believe," she said slowly, "that when you turned your back on me so I could seal the wound without being watched, that was not contempt." A pause. "Among my people, that gesture, giving someone privacy for their pain, is one of the highest forms of respect we have. We call it Serethin. We do not have a word for the reverse." He didn't type anything. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the Notacell was quiet. "I told Veleth about the weapons," she said in a different tone, the tone of someone shifting from one register to another, "because what they're about to say requires a different mode. The ones that killed my guard. The thermal signature." He held very still. "He told me I was mistaken. Battlefield conditions, confusion, stress, difficulty of accurate assessment while wounded." She paused. "He is usually right about these things. He has been my counselor for 11 years, and he has been right about most things he has ever told me." She looked at Corvin directly. "But I know what our weapons look like," she said. "I have attended 17 arms development reviews and 43 field capability demonstrations in my life. I know the secondary fracture pattern our pulse weapons leave in stone. I know the sound they make. I know the mark they leave." A pause. "Those were not our weapons." Corvin held her gaze and did not look away, and did not move, and did not type anything. She read his stillness. Something in her expression shifted. "You noticed it too," she said. It wasn't a question. After a moment he typed, "Yes." "Do you know what they were?" He typed, "I don't know. There is a memory associated with the pattern that I cannot access clearly. 3 years ago. It is stuck." She looked at this for a long moment. "Stuck how?" He typed, "My injury created a form of eidetic stress recording. High-stress experiences are encoded very accurately, but retrieval is not always complete or on demand. Some memories are there but not accessible from the indexable layer. I know the pattern from before. I know it's in there. I can't get to it." She read this twice. Then she looked up at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, not assessment, not caution, not the controlled dignity of someone maintaining Vethala under pressure. Something sharper, the look of a person who has just seen a thread and understood that pulling it will unravel something very large. "I see," she said. And then she stood and smoothed the front of her civilian clothes and looked at the door. "Get some sleep, Sergeant Corvin," she said. "I think the next several days will require us both to be functional." She left. The guard pulled the door closed behind her with a latch click. Corvin sat on the cot in the amber light of the Nauticell and thought about what she'd said and what she hadn't said, and the look on her face when she understood that the memory existed, even if it couldn't be reached. Somewhere in the station, he imagined, Dreschen was watching the footage of the meeting and thinking his own thoughts about what threads looked like when someone began to pull them. 3 weeks in custody had given Corvin a very detailed understanding of the Nauticell's particular properties. The light fixture ran at 70% and couldn't be adjusted. The air recycler completed a cycle every 8 minutes and 40 seconds, measured by the slight pressure change in his ears and the way the dust on the floor moved. The cot was approximately 4 centimeters shorter than his body, which meant he slept in one of 2 positions, slightly curled or with his feet over the edge. The wall to his left had a hairline crack in the concrete that ran diagonally from the air recycler duct to a point approximately 90 centimeters above the floor, and in certain lighting conditions it looked like the profile of a mountain range. He had read everything on his tablet that was accessible without network authorization, which was his own file, redacted in the sections that would have been most interesting. The 3-page summary of the Valathran legal debate, currently occupying a significant portion of the station's administrative energy, and a 600-page technical manual for the rebreather unit standards rank level that he had read twice through in its entirety because it was there. The dreams had started in the 2nd week. Not the usual ones. Corvin's usual combat dreams were the standard variety replays, variations on scenarios he'd lived through, the faces of the 19 arranged in configurations they'd never actually occupied. He was used to those. They were old furniture. These were something else. Ships. Specifically, the geometric profile of ships he didn't recognize from any operational briefing. He'd seen a lot of ships in 12 years, human military vessels in the full range of classes, Velhari warships in the configurations intelligence had documented, civilian transports, research vessels, the ungainly bulk carriers that moved resources between colony systems. He had a functional recognition catalog of several hundred vessel types. The ships in these dreams were not in that catalog. They were large carrier class, deep space rated, with a drive configuration that wasn't human and wasn't Velhari. The hull geometry was angular, in a specific way, with a particular relationship between the main body and the drive section that his brain kept trying to match to a category and not finding one. With the ships came coordinates, not named coordinates, not a system name or a sector designation that he could consciously attach a location to, but numbers, in the specific format that navigation data was expressed in. That felt familiar, in the way a song felt familiar when you'd heard it years ago and couldn't remember the name. And with the coordinates came the smell of recycled air with a trace element of something metallic and the sound of a pod's hull under stress, and the specific quality of semi-consciousness that came with a wound you'd been partially stabilized for, but hadn't been fully treated yet. 3 years ago, the Pallor Veil, a deep recon insertion into unmapped territory past the standard boundary. He'd come back from that mission in a medical bag with 3 cracked ribs, a head injury that had taken his voice and 3 weeks of his explicit memory, and a classified after-action report that said mission parameters not achieved, asset not recovered. Sergeant Corvin returned injured with partial data package. The partial data package had been the scanner readings from the first 42 minutes of the mission before the injury had occurred. Those had gone to intelligence. What the intelligence people had done with them, Corvin didn't know, because the mission was classed at a level above his clearance to read his own file. What the partial data package had not contained was whatever his eidetic stress recording had captured during the remaining 4+ hours he'd spent semi-conscious in the pod before retrieval. His stress recording had been running. It always ran. It had been running for 12 years, and it had recorded 847 hours of field time at high fidelity. The problem was retrieval, the system, his brain's trauma response, his psychology's notation that this was important, and to keep it stored everything, but the indexing was incomplete. The access was conditional, and some of what was stored was accessible only under specific triggering conditions that couldn't be engineered on demand. The ships, the coordinates, the metallic recycled air. He knew it was in there. He couldn't get to it the way you got to a thing you consciously remembered. On the 19th day, he did what he'd been avoiding doing because it was going to make things real in a specific way he wasn't ready for. He pulled the tablet into his lap and wrote down the coordinate strings as they appeared in the dreams, accepting that the numbers were approximate, the kind of approximate that came from reading a display while partly unconscious, which degraded the last 1 or 2 significant digits, and also noting the hull profiles in as much detail as he could describe in words, which was less than he needed because words weren't adequate for geometric relationships. On the 21st day, he understood why they weren't adequate. He needed to draw. He didn't have drawing implements. He had the tablet, which had note functions but no stylus, and rendered his finger-drawn lines in the kind of jagged approximation that lost the specific proportional relationships he needed to represent. He had the uniform he'd been wearing since custody began, which had pockets and a collar, and no part that could be used to make marks on surfaces. He had the cot. He had the light fixture. He looked at the wall with the diagonal crack, and he thought for a while, and then he got up and went to the sanitation unit and pressed his thumbnail against the edge of the sink fitting until the edge opened a thin line in the ball of his thumb. It was not a wound of any significance. It bled exactly the amount he needed. Over the next 3 hours, he worked on the wall opposite the door, below the height of the viewport panel, so it couldn't be seen from the corridor, pressing his thumb to the surface and drawing in the specific, careful way that someone draws when their medium is limited, and what they're trying to capture is something their hands remember, even if their conscious mind can't fully access it. Hull profiles, the specific geometry of the angular bow section, and the placement of the drive arrays. The proportional relationship between the main body's length and the width of the secondary hull where the cargo sections would be. The shape of the aft section where the carrier configuration showed its specificity, that particular arrangement of launch bays that wasn't in any human or Velhari carrier design he'd been briefed on. Then the secondary detail that had been in his dreams with the most persistence, the marking on the hull that his sleeping brain kept returning to. A symbol, or a set of symbols, repeated at regular intervals along the secondary hull. He drew what his hands remembered without trying to consciously identify it. Then he sat back and looked at what he'd drawn. The lines were imprecise, in the way that blood on concrete was always imprecise, and the proportions were the proportions of a man working from memory, not from technical drawings. But the shape was there. The specific relationship of bow to body to aft, the launch bay configuration, the markings. He stared at it and tried to bring up the retrieval that would name it and couldn't. He heard the door, not the latch, clicking, the specific sound of someone pressing their hand to the frame and waiting, the barely audible sound of weight distribution that said there was a person standing outside who was deciding something. Then, very quietly, a knock, 3 knocks, spaced. Not a guard's knock. A guard would have just opened it. He stood, moved to the door. There was no way to open it from the inside. He stood in front of it. "It's Veleth," said a voice in Velhari, quiet, translated on a slight lag by his implant. "The Queen's counselor." "I am. Not here in an official capacity. I would like to speak with you through the door." Corvin leaned his shoulder against the wall next to the door frame. Waited. "The Queen has asked me to deliver a message," Veleth said, still quiet. "She cannot come herself. The envoy Dreschen has requested a meeting with her at this hour, and she cannot decline without signaling knowledge she does not yet want him to know she has." A pause. "Her message is this: the tribunal date has been moved forward 4 days. Dreschen's arrangement. She believes you should know." Corvin knocked twice on the door from the inside. "Understood." Another pause. "She also asked me to tell you that she is thinking about what you said, that the memory is there but not accessible from the indexable layer." A pause that was longer than the others. "I have been her counselor for 11 years. I have made it my purpose to understand things she brings to me. I told her the weapon likely a misidentification. I told her this because I believe it is statistically probable." Another pause. "But I have been thinking, since she told me what you said, about the statistical probability of a human soldier choosing to carry a wounded Vilhari queen through a hostile battlefield on an independent assessment of what was right, and I find myself less certain of my probabilities than I was." A third knock from Corvin. "I heard you." 4 days, Veleth said. Then his footsteps receded down the corridor. Dreschen came back the following morning. He stood at the viewport for 3 minutes this time. He looked at Corvin. Corvin looked at him. Dreschen's expression had shifted from the careful, smooth warmth of the first visit to something that was still careful and smooth, but had a different undertone, the undertone of a person who has assessed a variable they'd initially categorized as manageable and is revising that categorization upward. "I've been looking into your background, Sergeant," he said. 12 years of service, exemplary field record. The injury 3 years ago, the subsequent reassignment to operations." He paused. "The deep recon insertion past the Polar Veil, the year before last." Corvin looked at him and typed nothing. "That must have been a difficult mission," Dreschen said. "The medical record indicates significant neurological trauma, a 4-day recovery gap in your conscious memory." Another pause. "I imagine large portions of that period are simply gone for you." Corvin held the tablet in his lap and did not type. "I find it interesting," Dreschen said, "how much of what we know is stored in forms that aren't fully accessible to us. Memory is such an imperfect system, isn't it? What we retain, what we lose, what we think we remember." He looked at Corvin with those slightly too wide, iridescent eyes. "I hope you're not troubling yourself trying to reconstruct things that are simply gone, Sergeant. That kind of effort rarely produces useful results, and it takes energy that might be better spent on what's coming." He left. Corvin sat for a long time after that, looking at the wall below the viewport panel, where the blood-drawn lines of the hull profiles had dried to rust brown against the gray concrete. Looking at the specific geometry. Looking at the markings repeated along the secondary hull. Dreschen had been in the corridor the night Veleth had delivered the message. The station on Zwas audio surveillance would have captured it, and Dreschen had come the following morning specifically to tell him, in the smooth, professional language of someone delivering an entirely different message on the surface, that he knew about the memory and believed it wasn't retrievable, and was making sure Corvin understood that this was fine, that this was expected, that there was no useful information there, which meant there was. That night, Queen Seraphine came to his door directly. She came with 2 of her personal guard and without Veleth, which told him something about what she was separating from her counselor's knowledge. And she did not knock, but instead said quietly to the guard at his door that she was invoking Velathron access rights. And the guard, after a 30-second pause in which he clearly made a decision that was going to generate paperwork, stepped aside. She entered, she looked at him, then she looked past him at the wall. He watched her see it, watched her face go through something complex and controlled, and arriving at a very specific point of stillness. She crossed the room in 4 steps and stood in front of the wall and looked at the lines he had drawn, the hull profiles, the drive arrangement, the geometric proportions of the carrier class he'd recorded semi-conscious in the dark past, the Polar Veil 3 years ago. She stood there for a long time. The emergency light above them had clicked down to 60% tonight, dimmer than usual, and in that dim amber, The rust-brown lines on the gray wall looked like something ancient, something that had been waiting to be read. "Tell me," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very precise. "Where did you see these ships?" He picked up the tablet.
Typed. I don't know. The location name. The coordinates are in my head but approximate. It was past the Pallor Vale 3 years ago. I was injured and semi-conscious for most of it. These came through in dreams these past weeks. She read it.
"Do you know what these ships are?" He typed. "No, they're not in any briefing I've had access to." She touched the wall, just the tips of her fingers, pressed lightly against one of the hull profile lines. Something in her posture had changed. The careful, controlled quality was still there, but underneath it something else was now visible. Something that was not fear, but was located in the same emotional territory. "Sergeant Corvin," she said. "These are Conclave carrier-class vessels." The marking she indicated, the symbol repeated along the secondary hull, is the Conclave Deep Space Logistics Division insignia. I was briefed on Conclave vessel types when I took office. My advisors considered it relevant to know who controlled the infrastructure. She turned to look at him. "These vessels are not military, they are cargo vessels. They transport goods between Conclave member systems." He typed, "What kind of goods?" She looked at him. In the amber light, her concentric golden eyes were very dark. "The cargo manifest is theoretically anything. Food, medical supplies, equipment, colonization materials." She paused, "or ordnance, if the manifest said something else." He stared at her. She stared at him. He typed.
"The weapons that killed your guard." "Yes," she said.
He typed.
"The weapons were
Conclave manufactured.
loaded from a Conclave cargo carrier past the Pallor Vale."
Transfer to someone. To both sides, she said, and her voice was very steady, in the way that voices were very steady when the alternative to steadiness was something that couldn't be allowed to happen in this room. If the Conclave has been supplying weapons to both sides of this war, if they have been deliberately creating and sustaining a conflict for whatever purpose they have. She stopped. Then the war. All of it. He typed. All of it. She took her fingers off the wall and turned to face him directly, and her face had passed through the complex processing and arrived at the other side of it, which was clear and cold and completely resolved. "I need the complete memory," she said. "The coordinates, the full hull identification. Everything your mind recorded that night past the Pallor Vale. I need it in a form that can be verified, not drawn on a wall in your blood, not an approximate coordinate string. I need it in a form that will hold up before the Galactic Council." She paused. "There is a way, but it requires your consent, fully informed consent, because it could kill you, and it could kill me, and it has never been attempted between our species." He looked at her. "Among the Velhari," she said, "we have a practice called Vethalathran, the truth touch. It is an act of absolute trust between two individuals. It means I open my full perceptual channel to you, and you to me. And what I experience is what you experience, and what you carry, I carry." She paused. "The touch goes to memory, to the places where memory lives below conscious access. It reaches the eidetic layer. It reaches everything." Another pause. "It is the most intimate thing my people do. It is done between lifelong partners, or between a queen and her most trusted counselors in moments of great crisis. It has never been done between a Velhari and a human because we do not know what will happen. The perceptual mismatch between species could cause neurological feedback in both of us. It could simply fail. It could do something neither of us can predict." She looked at him for a long moment. "Dreschen is moving the tribunal to 4 days from now. After the tribunal, you will be removed from this station in one direction, and I will be returned to Velhari space in another, and whatever is in your memory will remain inaccessible, and this war will continue for however many years it continues for, and the weapons will keep coming from wherever they keep coming from." She paused. "Or we do this." The amber light moved slightly with the air cycle. Corvin looked at the wall where he'd drawn the ships in his own blood, and at the queen standing in front of that wall with her hands loose at her sides, and at the 3 years he'd spent carrying something he couldn't name, and the 7 bodies on a culvert floor with wounds made by weapons that weren't what they seemed. He picked up the tablet. "Typed when?" She said, "Tomorrow night, when Dreschen's surveillance pattern has its gap." She left. He looked at the wall. "Tomorrow then." She came at the gap. Dreschen's surveillance had 3 patterns that rotated on a non-obvious schedule, and she had spent the intervening 36 hours in a set of behaviors designed to suggest she had accepted the tribunal timeline and was preparing for transfer meeting with Velith, reviewing documents, submitting 3 separate formal communications through the official channels Dreshan monitored. She had been, effectively, performing the behavior of a queen who had decided to play by the rules, and she had been performing it convincingly enough that when she dismissed her guard at the gap hour and told the monitoring post she needed 4 hours of uninterrupted rest before tomorrow's preliminary hearing, there was no flag. She came to his door with Veleth's medical kit in her own hands and nothing else. The guard outside his door was the same one who had let her through before. He looked at her and she looked at him, and he stood aside without requiring her to say anything, which she later thought said something very specific about what humans did when the situation was clear enough. She entered. She sat in the chair. He sat on the cot. She told him again what the truth touch was, slower and more completely than she had in the dim amber light of the previous night, because he deserved the complete version before the decision was final. She told him about the neural pathway, the way Vilhari perceptual architecture operated through bioelectric channels that extended into physical contact, the way the truth touch opened those channels fully, the way the receiver became simultaneous with the giver. She told him about what it felt like from the inside, not like watching a memory, but like being in one, completely, in real time. She told him that because the Vilhara perceptual system and the human system were differently structured, the connection might create feedback, which could range from temporary disorientation to something more permanent. She told him there was no way to know in advance. She told him all of this, and then she stopped and looked at him and waited. He looked at the tablet in his hands. He thought about what he was being asked to do, to open everything he carried, to a stranger, in a room barely large enough for both of them, with the possible result of permanent neurological damage or death, and with the possible alternative result of evidence that could stop a war that had cost 4 years and uncountable lives, and was built on a lie. He set the tablet down on the cot beside him. He held out his hand. She looked at his open palm for a moment. In 34 years, the occasions when she had performed the truth touch could be counted on her fingers, significant occasions, each one acts of absolute trust between individuals who had earned it. She had never reached across the boundary that separated her species from another. She didn't know what she would find there. She reached out and took his hand. What she found in male Corvin was not what she expected. She had expected a soldier. She had expected tactics and training, and the particular structured interior of someone who had spent 12 years calibrating their responses to conflict. She had expected, perhaps, some version of the cold functional clarity she'd seen in him, on the surface the efficient assessment, the economy of motion, the controlled stillness. What she found was that the surface was a single layer over something vast. The grief hit her first, not as a concept, as a physical weight, as something that actually had texture and mass and occupied space. And it was the specific kind of grief that came from having been present at the deaths of people you were responsible for and having survived when they did not. She felt it the way he felt it, from the inside out, and it was so large and so complete that for a moment she simply could not do anything else. The Velhari experienced grief differently, not less but differently. It was integrated into their emotional architecture as a ceremonial thing, a structured process with specific stages and forms and communal expressions. Corvin's grief was not any of those things. It was unstructured, it was continuous, it was carried without ritual, without framework, without resolution. It was the raw weight of absence, 19-fold, carried every day in the body, the same way the body carried scar tissue incorporated into the structure. Never healed, never resolved, just incorporated. She felt this, and she held it because it was what was being given to her and what she had consented to receive. And she held the channel open and went deeper. She saw the battlefield on Varath from his perspective, the approach, the thermal scanning, the decision point in the culvert when he had looked at her face and made the choice. She felt what had informed that choice, not strategy, not orders revised on the fly, but something foundational that existed below the level of decision, something that simply would not permit a particular action. She had been correct about what she'd read in his stillness. The not doing harm was not a choice Corvin made so much as a limit he discovered he had. She went deeper. 3 years back, the insertion passed the pallor veil. The memory was there. dense and dark and only partially indexed. The way things stored in high stress, partial consciousness were stored, with exceptional sensory fidelity, but without the framing of conscious context, without the labels and interpretations that awake comprehension provided. It was raw data. It was what his body had recorded while his mind was partly out. The recycled air with the metallic trace element. The sound of the pod's hull under the specific stress of a drive firing nearby. The way the light had changed on the pod's interior as something large passed between his position and the system's primary, a shadow, cast through the viewport, moving across his legs where he lay on the floor. She saw the ships, not drawn on a wall in approximate blood-rendered lines. The actual ships, processed through Corvin's eidetic recording with the fidelity of a system that had been logging everything even when the person it lived in hadn't been fully conscious. The hull geometry, sharp and complete. The drive configuration, the launch bay arrangement, the specific proportional relationships. The concave deep space logistics insignia, repeated at regular intervals along the secondary hull. She counted the ships. 8 carrier-class vessels, in a formation consistent with transfer operations rather than transit. She saw what they were transferring via Corvin's recording of the manifest readout he'd seen through a partially open cargo bay. A readout he hadn't been conscious enough to consciously register, but that his recording had captured in full crates, palletized, bearing shipping codes that didn't correspond to any civilian goods category. She recognized the codes. She was the Velhari Queen, and she had attended 17 arms development reviews and 43 field capability demonstrations, and she recognized ordnance shipping codes from both human and Velhari manifests because she had made it her purpose to know exactly what her military was doing and how it moved. These were not a single manifest. The crates were mixed. Some were human system ordnance shipping codes. Some were Velhari codes, both flowing from conclave carriers in the same transfer operation. She understood in the memory what she was looking at, and then she felt Corvin's response to what the memory carried, not anger, not the cold strategic calculation she might have expected from a soldier, but something simpler and in its own way more devastating, the specific internal quality of a person who has suspected something terrible and found out they were right, and the specific quality of sorrow that came with that confirmation, which was different from grief but lived in the same place. She came out of the memory. She was in the room, in the chair, holding Corvin's hand. She felt the channel still open, returning to surface level, the way you felt the transition from deep water to shallow, the pressure changing, the light increasing. She came back into the room and into herself, and she was crying. She hadn't known she was going to cry. It was not the Velhari way in general to cry without intention. Tears were used deliberately, as a communication, as a mark of specific meanings: respect, gratitude, grief for the dead. These were not those tears. These were something she didn't have a category for, because the sensation that had produced them was the sensation of receiving 19 deaths worth of unresolved grief in a span of minutes, plus the specific quality of a person who had been carrying something enormous in silence for years, because they had no other choice, plus the recognition that this carrying had not been empty, that had contained exactly the thing the moment required. She looked at Corvin. He was gray. Both hands clenched on the edge of the cot. His breathing was controlled in the way that breathing was controlled when someone was applying significant effort to the controlling. He was looking at the wall, not the wall with the drawings, the opposite wall with the expression of someone who has just spent several minutes in the worst of what they carry and has come back out and is currently taking inventory of what remains. She said, "Sergeant Corvin." He turned to look at her. His eyes were different, not physically, but the quality of what was in them. She had looked into his eyes in the culvert on Vareth, and she had looked into them 4 times in this room over the past weeks, and she knew what she had seen: a controlled, careful person looking out through a controlled, careful surface. What was in them now was not controlled. It was the thing that lived below the control, and it was looking at her with the specific quality of someone who has been completely seen and is deciding how to be in that. She was still holding his hand. "I have it," she said. "I have all of it. The coordinates, the manifests, the ships. I can project this through the Velhari bio-network, broadcast it the way we broadcast major communications through the living network, except this would be the memory directly, not a translation of it. The council would receive it as raw experience, the same way I received it, not a report, not testimony that can be questioned. The memory itself with all of its fidelity. She paused, but to project it, I need to re-enter the connection. And re-entering the connection with you means you would feel what I feel while I project, which would mean the door opened. It opened the way doors opened when someone outside had credentials and had decided to stop waiting, with the specific finality of an authority being exercised. Dreschen stepped through. Behind him were 6 individuals in conclave peacekeeping uniforms, the pale gray, with the silver trim. The authority insignia that indicated they were operating under official conclave mandate. They were carrying weapons, not sidearms, full tactical configuration, the kind that said someone had anticipated the possibility of a contested situation. Dreschen looked at Corvin, then at Seraphine, then at their hands, still connected. Something moved across his face that was not, for the first time in Corvin's experience of him, smooth. "Your Majesty," he said, in English, in a tone that was still calm, but had the specific quality of calm that required active maintenance. "I apologize for the intrusion. I had concerns about your security that required immediate verification." He looked at their hands. He looked at Corvin. He looked at the Queen's face. He said, "I see." She did not release Corvin's hand. "Envoy Dreschen," she said, in English, in the tone she used when she was performing the function of queen rather than the function of a person who was afraid. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Dreschen said, "is that the Conclave has reason to believe this facility has been compromised by a communications security breach. We are securing the premises in accordance with Conclave Emergency Protocol 14, which grants us authority to restrict movement and communication during an active security concern." He looked at her steadily. "Your Majesty, for your safety, I will need to ask you to accompany us to the Conclave secured wing, where you will have full comfort and security for the remainder of your stay." He said this with the perfect inflectionless professionalism of someone who had spent a great many years delivering messages that meant something different underneath. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "And the sergeant." Dreschen's expression was very careful. "The sergeant will be escorted to a more appropriate facility for the duration of the security concern." He paused. As a precaution, the 6 peacekeepers had arranged themselves in the room with the specific geometry of people who had been trained in close-quarters containment operations, 2 by the door, 2 flanking Dreschen, 1 on each side wall. They had not raised their weapons yet. They didn't need to. Seraphine looked at Dreschen for a long time. Then she looked at Corvin. In the amber light of the room, Corvin looked back at her, and what passed between them was not transmitted through language because language was not their medium. He had held out his hand an hour ago, knowing what it might cost. She was looking at him now with the question of what came next. He gave her the smallest nod he knew how to give. She turned back to Dreschen. "Of course," she said. "Let us proceed." But she squeezed Corvin's hand once, briefly, before she released it. And behind Dreschen's back, where the peacekeepers couldn't see it, she held up 2 fingers. 2 hours, he understood. They moved her efficiently, professionally, with the kind of formal courtesy that conclave peacekeepers maintain toward principals, even when the principals were being moved against their actual will, and she went with them in the way that someone went with authority they were choosing to temporarily accept because the alternative required conditions that didn't exist yet. The conditions needed 2 hours to exist. Dreschen left 2 peacekeepers at Corvin's door. From the inside, Corvin listened to them take their positions, one directly outside, one at the corridor junction 12 meters to the left, the specific configuration of someone covering both the room exit and the approach. The door was locked with Dreschen's credentials now, instead of the standard military lock, which meant the guard codes Corvin had observed the duty guards using for 3 weeks would no longer work. He sat on the cot. He breathed. He thought. She had said 2 hours. The Velhari bio-network was not instantaneous. A full projection broadcast required a preparation period and a sustained connection time during which the broadcaster was in a non-mobile, non-defensible state. She needed him to create conditions in which a projection could complete. She needed him alive and connected for the duration of that projection. She needed the station's external communication arrays intact so the broadcast could reach the Galactic Council receivers without being blocked. Dreschen who was not unintelligent, would be working on blocking those arrays. The window was whatever it was. Corvin stood and went to the wall with the hull drawings and crouched in front of it and pressed his palm against the surface. He held it there for a moment. Then he stood and went to the nacell's door and stood in front of it with his back against the wall and considered the options available to a person in a locked room with 2 armed guards outside, and approximately 90 minutes before the plan either worked or stopped working. He had spent 12 years solving problems with available resources. The available resources were his own body, his training, the uniform he was wearing, a tablet computer with no network access and very little battery remaining, and his complete and detailed knowledge of
Every aspect of this corridor and the room layout of the station's detention wing. From 3 weeks of listening through an imperfectly insulated door.
He pulled the tablet out of his pocket and checked the battery, 11%. He went to the door and knocked on it twice. Standard knock, nothing urgent. The viewport panel opened. The guard outside looked in. What? He held up the tablet facing the viewport. Battery dying. Need the charging cable from my equipment bag. The guard looked at him. The guard looked at the tablet display confirming 11%. The guard said, I'll have to check with. Corvin held up the tablet again, please. It's the only thing I have to read. The guard closed the viewport panel. Corvin heard a radio exchange brief, the guard asking someone, receiving a one-word answer. The viewport panel opened again. Step back from the door. He stepped back. The door opened 4 inches, the security chain engaged. A hand came through the gap with the charging cable. Corvin took it with his left hand. The hand was withdrawn. The door closed. He looked at the cable. It was a standard military-issue charging cable, approximately 2 meters long, with a robust connector on each end rated for field conditions. The casing was reinforced rubber over copper core. He thought for approximately 3 seconds. Then he went to work. He was ready in 40 minutes. The 2 minutes after that were the worst kind of waiting, the kind where the plan was complete, and the execution was dependent on timing outside his control, and there was nothing useful to do. He spent them sitting on the cot reviewing the station layout in his memory. Corridor outside his door, 12 meters to the corridor junction where the second guard was posted, then the main detention wing, then the administrative corridor, then the external communications array room, which was on the station's outer ring and had 2 redundant broadcast nodes that would each need to be unblocked for a successful Velhari bio-network transmission. He didn't know which room they had taken her to. He would have to find it. The sound he was listening for came at 43 minutes, which meant he had been off by 3 minutes, and the window was slightly shorter than calculated. It was the specific sound of a station's security system registering a secondary alarm, not the full klaxon, but the precursor tone that indicated a sensor trigger in a non-primary zone. From the pitch and direction, it was the eastern wing, 2 floors up. Veleth, who was not currently with the Queen because the Queen had very deliberately separated Veleth from her knowledge of tonight's plan, would nonetheless have understood from the station's patterns and the sudden change in Dreshan's behavior that something was happening. Veleth had been her counselor for 11 years, and he had been paying attention for that entire time. He would do what Veleth always did when circumstances shifted without clear direction. He would create a situation that required official response in order to understand what the official response was. He would, specifically, trigger a sensor alarm in whatever part of the station would pull the most resources, because Veleth understood that understanding where resources went told you where they had been concentrated. The guard outside Corvin's door spoke into his radio. One word, acknowledged. His footsteps moved 12 meters to the corridor junction. Both guards were now at the junction, discussing the alarm. Corvin had a window of approximately 45 seconds before one of them came back. He moved. The door lock's mechanism was a magnetic seal rated for standard security, but not for someone with a strand of copper wire, stripped from a charging cable, a basic knowledge of electromagnetic systems, and 3 weeks of listening to which frequency the duty guards used for their badge readers. The principle was simple. The execution required approximately 30 seconds of application. He had practiced it 3 times in his head before moving, and he moved clean. The door opened. He went into the corridor and moved toward the junction. The 2 guards at the junction were facing away from him toward the direction of the alarm. the way people faced when something interesting was happening at a distance. He came up behind the nearer one in the specific configuration of movement that training called close approach, non-alert, no hurry, no noise, nothing that triggered the peripheral awareness that guarded against obvious threats. He had been a solo recon operative for 3 years. He knew how to be quiet. He had always known how to be quiet, and the past 3 years had given him reasons to have practiced it more than he had. The first guard went down without sound. The second guard began to turn, and Corvin was already there, and the guard went down without sound either. He secured them both to the wall junction railing with the charging cable, took one sidearm and one comm unit, and moved down the corridor. He found Seraphine on the 3rd level. In the conclave designated guest quarters, a room substantially more comfortable than his nacelle, with actual windows and lighting that could be adjusted, and a communications console that was currently locked out of the external broadcast network by a conclave override. 2 peacekeepers outside the door, the same configuration as his had been. He took them down the same way. The door's lock was conclave grade, more sophisticated than his had been. He stood in front of it and thought for 4 seconds. Then he used the comm unit he'd taken from the guard and keyed the frequency. Dreshan had been broadcasting on. Since his arrival, he'd cataloged it from the guard conversations he'd listened to through his door. He transmitted a burst of electronic noise, the specific kind that conclave systems recognized as a credential request, and waited. The door attempted to authenticate. He broke the authentication attempt with the copper wire the same way he'd broken his own door. The lock registered an error and defaulted open. He went in. She was standing in the center of the room with her hands clasped in front of her, in the posture of someone who had been waiting and had been prepared to wait for however long it took. When he came through the door, something in her posture changed, not relieved, exactly, because relief implied having been uncertain, and she looked as though she had not permitted herself to be uncertain. She looked at the sidearm in his hand and the comm unit and the state of him generally, and said, "How long do we have?" He held up all 10 fingers, maybe. "The communication array is locked out," she said. "Dreshan has a conclave system override on the broadcast nodes. We need physical access to the node controls on the outer ring to clear it." He held up one finger, one of the 2 nodes or both. "One," she said. "The network just needs one clear node. The other can be blocked." He nodded. He pointed at her, then at himself, then at the door. She nodded. They moved. The outer ring of the station was 3 corridors and 2 elevators from the guest quarters, which meant 8 minutes at a careful pace, or 4 minutes at a pace that accepted being heard. He chose the middle option, not silent, not announced. The pace of someone moving with purpose through a facility they had business in, which in a busy station was often more invisible than attempting full concealment. They met Dreshan's response at the 2nd corridor. 3 peacekeepers. Coming from the east. Moving fast, which meant Dreshan had been notified faster than Corvin's window had accounted for. He processed the situation in under a second. 3 armed his sidearm, and 1 advantage of positioning at a corridor junction. Seraphine behind him. The node room 60 meters further down the outer ring corridor. She said very quietly. "The node room, I know the system. I need 4 minutes." He looked at her. He held up the sidearm and pointed at the peacekeepers and then pointed at her and made a question with his face. She shook her head. She didn't want the weapon. She knew the conclave system. She knew how to clear the override if she had 4 minutes and physical access to the node. He pointed at himself and then at the corridor junction. She said, "Please be careful." He gave her the smallest possible smile, the kind that didn't make promises, and she moved down the outer ring corridor toward the node room, and he moved to the corridor junction. He didn't have adequate cover. He had a corridor wall, a sidearm, with the charge count of whoever had been carrying it, and training. The 3 peacekeepers came around the junction corner, and he was already there. He took the first one down before they'd registered he was present. The second one got a shot off that hit the wall to his left. The sound was enormous in the corridor. A tactical weapons report in an enclosed space, and his ears rang the way they always rang, and he compensated the way he'd learned to compensate and moved into the second peacekeeper before they could adjust their aim. The third one was more careful, positioning around the junction corner, and the next 30 seconds were the specific unpleasant combination of careful violent movement and insufficient cover that solo recon trained for and never liked. He took a hit on his left side, not clean glancing, enough to burn through the uniform and score the skin beneath, enough to register as something that was going to matter later but could be managed for now. He kept moving. 3 down. He pressed against the wall and breathed and listened. The station's alarm was at full klaxon now. From down the outer ring corridor, he heard nothing, no sounds of conflict, no shots, which meant she'd reached the node room and was working, or she'd been stopped in silence, and he was going to proceed as though it was the former, because the alternative required him to do something he had no plan for. He heard footsteps. More of them. Dreschen had at least 6 peacekeepers on the station, and he'd taken 3 down. The remaining 3 would be coming from 2 possible directions. He moved to the junction with the outer ring corridor and held the position with what he had. The thing about holding a position alone, with inadequate cover and an unknown number of incoming threats, was that the math was very simple. You didn't survived it long enough for the situations to change by some factor that wasn't you. He had done this twice before in the field under different circumstances, and both times the situation had changed in time. He was aware that the precedent was not a guarantee. The first of the 3 came around the far end of the corridor, and he managed the engagement from the junction corner, and the second came from behind him, and he was not fast enough for clean on the second one. And the hit, this time, was not glancing. It caught him high on the left arm, and the arm went numb from the shoulder down, and the sidearm went to his right hand, and he kept moving. 2 down, 1 remaining, positioned behind him at a distance that made the approach angle unclear. He pressed against the wall. His arm was numb, his side was burning. He breathed. From the node room 60 meters down the corridor, he heard a tone, a single clear, resonant frequency that wasn't an alarm and wasn't a weapon and wasn't any sound a military station made in normal operation. It was a Velhari frequency. He recognized it because he'd spent 3 years learning what the Velhari sounded like. She had cleared the node. He heard the broadcast begin. Not with his ears, the bio-network transmission was outside human auditory range, but he felt it in the specific way that the truth touch had changed his sensitivity to the frequencies her species used, a vibration at the edge of consciousness that said, "This is happening. The memory is moving. What you carried is traveling." He felt it begin to travel. The ships passed the Pallor Veil, the manifests, the ordnance codes, the 4 years of a war built on supplied weapons and manufactured grievances. He felt it the way he'd felt her receive it, not a file being transmitted, but as an experience being shared, raw and unfiltered and undeniable. And simultaneously, in the way the truth touch worked, he felt what she felt while broadcasting, which was the weight of what was being sent. 19 names moving with the data. The burn pattern on a culvert floor. A mute soldier in a dim room drawing ships in his own blood because that was the only language available. The last peacekeeper came around the corner, and Corvin was out of position and out of cover, and the shot went wide of both of them, and he moved into the range where weapons became irrelevant, and put the peacekeeper down with what he had left, which was not very much and was sufficient. He slid down the wall until the floor accepted his weight. The outer ring corridor was quiet except for the klaxon, which was now cycling through its secondary tone, and his own breathing, which was louder than he'd like. He sat against the wall with his right hand, holding pressure on his left arm, and felt the broadcast moving through whatever the bio-network moved through. Felt the council chambers somewhere receiving what he had carried in silence for 3 years. Felt the specific quality of a truth, arriving in a place that hadn't known it was missing. Then the broadcast ended. The silence after it was different from the silence before. He heard, very faintly, from the direction of the node room, footsteps. She came around the corner of the outer ring corridor and saw him on the floor and crossed the distance between them in 8 steps and crouched in front of him, and her hands went to the wound on his arm first, professional and precise, and then to the burn on his side, assessing, her face very still, in the way faces were still when they were holding something back. It went through, she said. All of it, the full memory, the manifests, the coordinates, the hull identification. The council received it simultaneously in every chamber. Dreschen is, she paused, currently being detained by his own peacekeepers, who received the broadcast the same way everyone else did. She pressed her hand against the wound on his arm with more pressure. He did not account for the fact that his peacekeepers are also conclave members subject to the network. Corvin looked at the ceiling. The alarm had stopped. He wasn't sure. When it had stopped, he looked at her. He didn't have the tablet. It was somewhere he'd left it, 3 rooms and 3 corridors ago. He had nothing to write on. He had his hands, one of which was numb, and his face, and whatever a face could say, without language. She was watching him with the expression she'd had in the culvert, the first time, the one he hadn't been able to name, that he'd filed for later. He thought he could name it now. It was the expression of someone who has found something unexpected and is still in the moment of finding it, hasn't categorized it, hasn't assigned it to a framework, is just experiencing the fact of it. You should know, she said, what I saw. In the truth touch, she paused. I saw why you couldn't leave me on that battlefield, and I want you to know. Another pause, and her voice had the quality of someone choosing words that were the right ones rather than the easy ones. That what drives you to that choice is not a flaw. Among my people, we have a word for the quality that cannot permit harm to a person in front of it, regardless of the cost to itself. Serethan Veleth. It translates approximately as the refusal that comes from being unable to be otherwise. She looked at him steadily. We consider it one of the highest qualities a person can have, because it is not chosen. It is simply what they are. He looked at her. He had no language to respond with. He had not had language for 3 years, and he had learned everything a person could do without language, and right now none of it was sufficient. He had things in him that wanted to be words and weren't, that had been wanting to be words for 3 years, and some of them, the ones that needed saying right now, in this corridor, with this person, were pressing against the place where the pathway had been severed, and the pathway was still severed, would always be severed, and there was nothing to do about that, except. He felt it before he understood what was happening. The truth touch had changed something, not in his neurology, not physically, not in the severed pathway, but the broadcast, the sustained re-entry, the second transmission while fighting, the full sustained connection across a human Velhari bridge that had never been built before, had done something to the perceptual architecture that connected him to the biofrequency she operated on. He could feel the Velhari network the way a person with restored hearing heard sound for the first time, overwhelming, strange, enormous, and real. And through that connection, something else, the specific quality of what she was transmitting to him right now, through her hand on his arm and her eyes on his face, and the way she was crouching in the corridor with him, as though the corridor was a perfectly adequate place to be the quality of being seen, completely, and not looked away from. He had been in silence for 3 years. He had learned to carry things in silence, that silence was not meant to carry. He had been, in every room and corridor of his life, the person who was understood by the version of himself that others invented for his silence. He felt his throat move. He felt the pathway that had been severed do something it had not done in 3 years. It was not fully healed. It was not restored. It was permeable, in the specific way that a channel not fully closed could be forced through when the pressure was sufficient. He tried. His throat worked around it, around the 3 years of silence, and the pathway that wasn't entirely there, and the word he found, the one that had the most weight behind it, the one that needed the most to be said, was 1 syllable. Her name. It came out rough and broken and barely audible, with the quality of something that had been a long time trying to become itself. It was the most imperfect word he had ever produced. It was the only word he had produced in 3 years. She went very still. He cleared his throat, or tried to. The pathway closed again. Immediately, the pressure gone. 1 word was what it had been, and it was enough, and it was all. She looked at him, then she took his hand. Not in truth touch. Not in the open palm formal offering of her people's ritual of trust. Just his hand in hers. The way 2 people held each other's hands when one of them was on a corridor floor, and the other was crouching next to them, and words in any language, through any channel, were insufficient and not required. The aftermath of the Truth Touch broadcast occupied 6 weeks of Galactic Council sessions, 14 formal hearings, 1 emergency suspension of conclave governance pending investigation, and a ceasefire agreement between humanity and the Velhari that was signed at Varath Station, in a room adjacent to the outer ring corridor where the floor still showed scuff marks from equipment that had been moved hastily. The formal charges against Sergeant Mail Corvin were reviewed and ultimately withdrawn on the basis that the insubordination the charges had cited, transporting a Velhari national contrary to mission parameters, had directly led to the revelation of a multi-year conclave conspiracy to manufacture and sustain the conflict, and that the mission parameters themselves had been issued under influence of that conspiracy. The withdrawal was a legal formality. It took 8 months. During those 8 months, Veleth, who had spent the night of the broadcast triggering sensor alarms in the Eastern Wing with the specific tactical elegance of a man who had been paying careful attention for 11 years and knew exactly what he was doing, conducted his own investigation into the weapons supply question, and produced a secondary report that corroborated every aspect of the memory evidence with documentary records the conclave had failed to purge from encrypted secondary archives. He submitted this report to the council without comment. He submitted a companion memo to Queen Seraphine that said only, "I was wrong to dismiss the weapons question. I will not be wrong about the same thing twice." She told Corvin about the memo. He was in the station's proper medical facility by then, in a room with adjustable lighting and a window and a charging cable that he was no longer required to use as a security bypass tool. He had been there for 3 weeks. His arm was healing. His side was healing. The neurological review conducted by a team that included both human and Velhari specialists had produced a report that described, with significant scientific uncertainty and considerable fascination, what appeared to be an altered interface between his perceptual system and Velhari bio-network frequencies, and concluded that the long-term implications were unknown, but the short-term indicators were stable. He had not produced another word since the one word in the corridor. He had tried twice, in the specific way you tested a repaired structure carefully, without full weight, ready to stop if it gave. The pathway closed each time before anything came through. The one word might have been exactly that. One word, produced by exactly that specific combination of circumstances and connection and pressure, and not repeatable. He had decided he was content with this. He had been in silence for 3 years, and silence had turned out to carry more than he had expected. It had carried the thing that ended a war. It was not nothing. On the afternoon of the 42nd day, she came to see him again. She sat in the chair. He sat on the bed. The adjustable light was on at 80%, which was the level he had decided he preferred, and the window showed the gas giant Vareth Prime in its characteristic amber and gray, filling the left half of the sky. She had brought his field tablet, fully charged, on the grounds that she assumed he would want it. He took it and held it but didn't type yet. "The council's investigation is producing some interesting findings," she said. "It appears that the conclave's involvement in the conflict was more extensive than even what your memory provided. The weapons supply was the central mechanism, but there were subsidiary operations, diplomatic interference. Intercepted communications altered before delivery. 2 ceasefire proposals that were presented to each side as having been rejected by the other, when in fact neither side had received the actual proposal." She paused. "We agreed to a war we did not choose, on terms that were invented for us, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything either of us actually wanted." He typed. "What did they want?" "To prevent the Varath array from being controlled by either party," she said. "If humanity and the Velhari control the array jointly, the Pallor Veil is transparent to both sides, and the Conclave's advantage, which was being the only organization with information networks that penetrated the veil, disappears entirely." She looked at him. "We were fighting over the right to see clearly, and the Conclave was manufacturing the fight to prevent us from seeing clearly. And what ended it was a soldier who could not speak, who had recorded the truth in the only archive that could not be searched or altered or deleted, which was his own memory." He looked at the tablet and typed, "I didn't know it was in there." "I know," she said. "That is perhaps the most important part." She paused. "Dreschen knew the mission had occurred. Dreschen knew you had been in that area of space at that time. But he assessed correctly, based on standard intelligence practice, that a mission that produced no useful data by your own medical report and no cognitive access by subsequent psychological evaluation was a closed variable. He did not assess for the eidetic layer. No one did." He typed. "A recording no one knew to look for. Kept safe," she said, "by the fact that the only person who could have reported it could not report it." She was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about this a great deal, the sequence of things that had to align. The way the injury that took your voice also preserved the only evidence of what happened past the veil. The way Dreshen's network penetrated every official channel, but not the private archive of a sergeant's neurological stress response. She paused. I am not generally a person who believes in cosmological significance, but I find myself unable to attribute this entirely to chance. He typed, I'm not sure what I believe. Neither am I, she said. I am sure of fewer things than I was before. A pause, and certain of more. He looked at the tablet for a moment. Then he typed, you cried when you came out of the touch. She met his eyes. Yes, you'd experienced human grief. That was why. That was part of why, she said. She was quiet for a moment. The other part was what I felt coming out after receiving everything you carry. There is a word in Velhari for the specific quality of someone who has given everything they have and still asks what else is needed. We use it rarely. It is a word for a quality we consider almost beyond our capacity to honor appropriately. She paused. I have used it perhaps twice before in my life, for individuals I have known deeply for decades. Another pause. I find myself thinking it applies. He typed, what's the word? She told him. Her voice, when she said it, had the particular quality of something being meant completely. He repeated it back to himself in the silence of his head. He would not be able to say it out loud. He thought about what it meant to have a word for a quality without the ability to say the word. Then he typed, I don't have the language for what I want to say. She said, you said my name. He typed, that was one word. It was, she said. It was also, depending on the context, sufficient. She looked at him with those concentric golden eyes. Among my people, we say, the meaning arrives before the words, or it does not arrive at all. The words are how you tell someone the meaning came, but they are not the meaning itself. He held the tablet in his lap and looked at her and thought about that. He thought about 3 years of silence and the things he'd learned to carry in it and the things he'd learned it could carry that he hadn't expected. He thought about 19 names and one name said in a corridor and the specific quality of being understood without translation. He set the tablet down. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. Not truth touch, not ritual, not the species boundary being crossed in service of evidence and evidence in service of survival. Just two people sitting in a room with a window showing an amber sky, holding the specific weight of what had been built between them in the only medium available, which was the one that had always been there before language. Underneath language, the thing that language was invented to approximate. Outside the window, Varath Prime turned in its slow, massive way, indifferent to the things occurring in the small, bright room on the surface of its moon, and the gas giant's rings caught the distant sun in a pale and silent arc. Inside, neither of them said anything. It was not empty silence. It was the other kind.